There is a portrait of Jane Seymour painted by Hans Holbein the Younger in 1536 or 1537. It is one of the most technically perfect portraits of the Tudor period. She sits upright, her expression is composed, not cold, not warm, watchful. The gown is extraordinary, cloth of gold and crimson, jeweled French hood, a pomander chain at her waist. Every detail is precisely rendered. Every detail is the portrait of a queen. But look at the eyes. Jane Seymour's eyes in Holbein's portrait are doing something that the formal composition of the painting almost obscures. They are not looking at you, they are looking slightly past you, measuring, calculating, waiting. History has been remarkably unkind to Jane Seymour, not through cruelty, but through dismissal. She is the third wife, the one between the famous ones. The quiet one, the one who died before she could become interesting. That version of Jane Seymour is almost entirely wrong. Tonight, we are going to meet the real Jane. The woman who watched two queens fall and decided she would not. The woman who played the most dangerous game at the most dangerous court in Europe and nearly won. Nearly. Jane Seymour was born around 1508. The exact date is not recorded, which tells you something immediately about how the world regarded daughters of the English gentry. She was the third child of Sir John Seymour of Wolf Hall in Wiltshire and his wife Marjorie Wentworth. The Seymours were not insignificant. They were old gentry, respectable, connected, ambitious in the measured way that English families of their class tended to be ambitious. Sir John had served at court. The family had land. They had access. What they needed was elevation. And in Tudor England, the fastest route to elevation was a daughter placed correctly at court. Jane arrived at the court of Henry VIII as a lady-in-waiting. First, it is believed, in the household of Catherine of Aragon, and later in the household of Anne Boleyn. She watched both queens from close proximity. She watched what worked. She watched what failed. She watched Henry. Jane Seymour was not, by the standards of Tudor court beauty, remarkable. Contemporary accounts describe her as pale, fair, and pleasant-faced rather than striking. She was not the dark, magnetic Anne Boleyn. She was not the dignified, imperious Catherine. She was something else. And that something else turned out to be exactly what Henry needed at the exact moment he needed it. She was quiet, calm, deferential in manner. After years of Anne Boleyn's sharp tongue and political maneuvering, after the decade-long battle over Catherine's marriage, after the rupture with Rome and the executions and the paranoia, quiet was extraordinarily appealing. Jane understood this, which is why the question of whether Jane Seymour was the passive, gentle creature history has made her, or a highly intelligent woman who deployed passivity as strategy, is one of the most interesting questions in all of Tudor history. By 1535, Henry VIII was a man in crisis. He had torn England from the Catholic Church for the right to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. He had executed men who opposed him. He had remade the religious landscape of an entire nation. He had done all of this for Anne, for the son she had promised him. Anne had given him a daughter, Elizabeth, and 2 or possibly 3 miscarriages. One of those later pregnancies in early 1536 is believed by some historians to have been a malformed fetus. Whether this is accurate or a story constructed by Henry's court to justify what came next, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that by early 1536, Henry had stopped loving Anne Boleyn, or had allowed himself to stop, which in a man of his temperament amounts to the same thing. And Jane was there. Henry began sending Jane gifts, jewels, letters. Jane's response, advised almost certainly by her ambitious brothers Edward and Thomas Seymour, was a masterclass in controlled restraint. When Henry sent her a purse of gold coins, she returned it, unopened, with a message that she had no greater treasure than her honor. This was not virtue, this was tactics. Jane and her advisors understood something essential about Henry VIII. He valued most what was withheld from him. The chase mattered. Anne Boleyn had understood this too, and had played it brilliantly for years. Jane played a different version of the same game. Where Anne had been exciting and dangerous, Jane was virtuous and safe, and dangerous in an entirely different way. Henry was captivated. Within weeks of Anne Boleyn's arrest in May 1536, Arrested on charges of adultery and treason that most modern historians regard as fabricated, Jane had been moved to a house 12 miles from the palace for convenience of access. Henry visited her daily. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19th. Henry and Jane were betrothed on May 20th. They were married on May 30th. 11 days between a beheading and a wedding, Jane Seymour became Queen of England on May 30th, 1536. She was approximately 28 years old. Henry was 44. Her motto, chosen deliberately, was "bound to obey and serve." Her critics, then and now, have read this as submission. Her supporters rate it as extraordinarily shrewd positioning. After Anne Boleyn's fate, advertising obedience was not weakness, it was survival. Jane's time as queen was short, just over a year, but it was not passive. She worked steadily and carefully towards specific goals. She advocated for the restoration of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the royal succession. Mary, in particular, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, sidelined and humiliated for years, found in Jane an unexpected ally. Jane approached Henry on Mary's behalf. Henry's reaction was volcanic. He did not tolerate interference in matters of succession. Jane reportedly fell to her knees and begged him to reconsider, framing Mary's restoration as beneficial to the stability of the realm. Whether through Jane's influence or through other political calculations, Henry eventually allowed Mary back to court. This mattered, and Jane knew it would matter. Building alliances with Henry's existing children was not sentimentality, it was politics. She also moved carefully through the dangerous terrain of the English Reformation. Jane was, by personal inclination, more conservative in religion than Anne Boleyn, closer to the old Catholic traditions, though not openly Catholic. When the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive northern uprising against Henry's religious reforms, shook England in late 1536, Jane reportedly appealed to Henry to show mercy to the rebels. Henry's response was a reminder, delivered coldly, that the last queen who had meddled in his affairs had paid for it. Jane never raised the subject again. She was learning the precise dimensions of the cage she lived in. Jane Seymour became Queen of England on May 30th, 1536. She was approximately 28 years old. Henry was 44. Her motto, chosen deliberately, was "bound to obey and serve." Her critics, then and now, have read this as submission. Her supporters read it as extraordinarily shrewd positioning. After Anne Boleyn's fate, advertising obedience was not weakness, it was survival. Jane's time as queen was short, just over a year, but it was not passive. She worked steadily and carefully towards specific goals. She advocated for the restoration of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the royal succession. Mary, in particular, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, sidelined and humiliated for years, found in Jane an unexpected ally. Jane approached Henry on Mary's behalf. Henry's reaction was volcanic. He did not tolerate interference in matters of succession. Jane reportedly fell to her knees and begged him to reconsider, framing Mary's restoration as beneficial to the stability of the realm. Whether through Jane's influence or through other political calculations, Henry eventually allowed Mary back to court. This mattered, and Jane knew it would matter. Building alliances with Henry's existing children was not sentimentality, it was politics. She also moved carefully through the dangerous terrain of the English Reformation. Jane was, by personal inclination, more conservative in religion than Anne Boleyn, closer to the old Catholic traditions, though not openly Catholic. When the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive northern uprising against Henry's religious reforms, shook England in late 1536, Jane reportedly appealed to Henry to show mercy to the rebels. Henry's response was a reminder, delivered coldly, that the last queen who had meddled in his affairs had paid for it. Jane never raised the subject again. She was learning the precise dimensions of the cage she lived in. By early 1537, Jane was pregnant. This news transformed everything. Henry's obsession with a male heir had driven the defining events of his reign. The break with Rome, the destruction of Catherine of Aragon, the execution of Anne Boleyn. Two queens had failed to give him a surviving son. If Jane succeeded where they had failed, she would be untouchable. The court watched her pregnancy with an attention that was almost predatory in its intensity. Jane was kept away from anything that might cause distress or alarm. When the sweating sickness appeared near court, The entire royal household was relocated. When messengers brought bad news, it was filtered before reaching her. She was, in the most literal sense, treated as a vessel for the future of the Tudor dynasty. Whether Jane found this suffocating or reassuring, we cannot know. Her letters from this period, what survives of them, are formal and give nothing away. On October 12, 1537, the feast day of St. Edward the Confessor, patron of English kings, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. He was named Edward. Henry wept. Grown men at court wept. Bonfires were lit across England. The Te Deum was sung in every church in London. The relief and the joy of the court were, by all accounts, entirely genuine. Henry VIII had his son, and Jane Seymour had given him what no other queen had managed. She should have been safe. She wasn't. In the days following Edward's birth, Jane appeared well. She sat up in bed. She received visitors. She wrote letters. The birth had been long, a labor perhaps 2 to 3 days, but she had survived it. Then, within a week, she developed what contemporaries described as childbed fever. We would today call it puerperal fever, a bacterial infection, almost certainly streptococcal, entering through wounds sustained during delivery. In the 16th century, before germ theory, before antibiotics, before any understanding of what caused it, puerperal fever was a death sentence. It killed women by the thousands in every stratum of society. Jane deteriorated rapidly. She became delirious. She burned with fever. The court physicians, armed with nothing useful, could only watch. Henry's response tells us something real about how he felt about Jane. He did not leave. He stayed close, receiving hourly reports. He canceled engagements. His letters from this period, rare in their emotional transparency for a man usually so guarded, convey something that reads unmistakably as genuine fear. On October 24, 1537, 12 days after giving birth to the son Henry had wanted for 30 years, Jane Seymour died. She was approximately 29 years old. Henry wore black for 3 months. He retreated from public life. He refused for a period to conduct routine business. When his advisors began pressing him toward a fourth marriage, diplomacy required it, the succession required it, he reportedly wept and said he was too grieved to consider it. This was not performance, or not only performance. Henry VIII, who had discarded 2 wives and executed 1, was genuinely, visibly broken by the death of Jane Seymour. What does that tell us? Perhaps that Jane was the wife who cost him nothing, who gave him everything he wanted and asked for very little. Perhaps that her death at the moment of his greatest triumph made her impossible to resent. Perhaps simply that grief in a man like Henry was easier than the complex emotions that came with wives who were still alive and still capable of disappointing him. Or perhaps, and this is the reading many historians favor, Jane Seymour was genuinely deeply loved, in the specific, conditional, dangerous way that Henry VIII loved anyone. Jane Seymour's body lay in state at Hampton Court for nearly 2 weeks. She was then moved to Windsor Castle, where she was interred in St. George's Chapel. Her son, Edward, would become King Edward VI of England at the age of 9, following his father's death in 1547. He would reign for 6 years, pursuing the Protestant reforms his father had begun, before dying at 15 of tuberculosis. The daughters she had advocated for, Mary and Elizabeth, would both eventually rule England as queens regnant, Mary for 5 years, Elizabeth for 45. The English Reformation that Jane had quietly tried to moderate would transform the country utterly. The monasteries dissolved, the old faith suppressed, a new church built on Henry's desire for a son, reshaping the spiritual landscape of a nation for centuries. Jane had tried, in her quiet way, to soften the edges of all of it. She had failed mostly. The political forces were too large, Henry too committed. But the attempt mattered. Henry VIII married 3 more times after Jane. Anne of Cleves, whom he found so physically repellent that the marriage was annulled after 6 months. Catherine Howard, a teenager he married and later executed on adultery charges. Catherine Parr, who survived him. None of them received what Jane received. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, he left instructions that he be buried beside Jane Seymour at Windsor. Not beside Catherine of Aragon, his wife of 23 years. Not beside Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had remade the Church of England. Beside Jane. They lie there still. Vault 26 beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. He chose her in death as he had chosen her in life, because she had given him what he wanted and had never made him pay for wanting it. So who was Jane Seymour really? Was she the gentle, virtuous queen of Tudor mythology, the true wife, the good mother, the calm after the storm? Or was she a calculating political operator who understood the court she moved through better than almost anyone else and deployed her apparent passivity as a weapon with extraordinary precision? The honest answer is probably both, and possibly something more complex than either. She was a woman who had watched two of the most powerful queens in English history, Catherine of Aragon, who had fought with dignity and lost, and Anne Boleyn, who had fought with brilliance and lost, and had drawn a very specific lesson from both of them. The lesson was not be passive, among. The lesson was choose your battles with absolute precision. Win the ones that matter, let the rest go. She won the battle for Henry's affection. She won the battle for Mary's restoration. She won the battle for a son. She ran out of time to win anything else. Jane Seymour died at 29, 12 days after giving her husband the one thing he had destroyed his kingdom to obtain. She never got to see what that son became. She never got to see Elizabeth's England. She never got to know whether her quiet, careful strategy had truly worked or had simply delayed the inevitable. History gave her the title of Henry's favorite wife. It also gave her the shortest reign. Make of that what you will. If Jane's story stayed with you, if the question of who she really was stayed with you, then you're exactly the viewer this channel exists for. The Tudor court was full of women whose real intelligence, real strategy, and real suffering have been buried under centuries of simplified mythology. We're going to find them one by one. Subscribe to Dark Ages Chronicles. Leave a comment. Do you think Jane Seymour was a political strategist? Or was she exactly who she appeared to be? Stay in the shadows. Stay curious. See you in the next one.